He bought that site for $5 million and sold it within 4 months for $18 million.
Today, we've got a very, very important podcast all around finance and property. We've got Chris Wright from Fincierge that's joining us on the panel today.
The banks assess those loans differently. They don't need your serviceability to assess a property development transaction. It's also a weakness if you've got a full-time job.
With private lending, where does the actual money come from?
So we would probably classify private lending into 3 distinct groups. So the first group would be...
What's the fundamental difference between the private and the traditional lending when it comes to serviceability?
So many years ago...
What are some of the biggest mistakes that new property developers making?
I can't talk too much about other people, but...
Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of the Unemployable podcast. Today, we've got a very, very important podcast all around finance and property and how to get a lot of your property deals financed. We've got Chris Wright from Fincierge that's joining us on the panel today. He's driven down from Noosa, beautiful Noosa on the Sunshine Coast here in Queensland to join us. Just want to give a big thank you to Chris. Thank you for coming.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And for those of you guys that don't know who we are, we've got Carson and we've got Shannon here that joins us on the panel, and they have a business called Salt Developments. Now, Salt Developments basically are land, their business revolves around land development and land subdivisions. 4 years ago, Carson was cleaning carpets. Shannon was a machine operator. They'd done a couple property courses. They took action, and 4 years later, they've accumulated about $100 million worth of deals in the pipeline and about 170 lots of land, which is, I love telling that story, and I'll never, ever get sick of saying that, because whenever I meet someone and I tell them what we're doing, they're just like, what an amazing story. I just want to know more. And I myself have been in real estate for quite some time, done a lot of small scale and unit developments here, predominantly on the Gold Coast. And my finance background really has always been traditional banking. You know, it's serviceability. You guys will hear the word serviceability, service. And what that actually means basically is earn a lot of money, pay a lot of tax, and the banks will, the big 4 banks, the traditional financing banks will fund your projects. And today we're really not going to be going down that road a little bit. Today we're going to be talking about non-traditional financing methods rather than the big 4 banks. And we're going to be talking about, you know, private lending, and you're going to hear about mezzanine lending and these types of things. But before we get right into that, Chris, give us a little bit of a background, because you got an interesting history with NAB and you've been in the corporate banking sector for 22 years. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I started my banking career with the National Bank in Brisbane. Had 12 months there and had a relief opportunity to fill in up in Noosa for a couple of weeks, and thought, why not? Got there and got the job, or got offered the job the day I arrived, and phoned my wife and said, would you like to move to Noosa? And she was an English backpacker in a previous life, and had had a really good experience with Noosa, so she was very keen to get there. So we moved up there with my young family, and that was it virtually for our corporate career. There's not a lot of corporate action going on in Noosa, so I had a couple of good years in the banks, and I think around the GFC, so I was around 7 years into my career. The GFC came along and really opened my eyes up to the downside of a market. In my lifetime prior to that, I hadn't seen it really. I was too young in the 80s to see the turmoil there, but this hit home, and it hit a lot of people very hard, particularly in the bank industry. So I got into finance broking shortly after the GFC, took a plunge and went out on my own, did a little bit of consulting, thought in my time as a banker, I saw plenty of developers come to us and say, here's a deal, here's the feasibility, I'm going to make $5 million out of this project. Well, that looks pretty easy. Not realising that they'd spent months or years to get to that point to sit in front of me as a banker and request the money. So I thought, let's have a crack at property development while I'm out there. And so that probably was the best lesson I learned, not just from banking, but actually being a property developer and really understanding what they go through to actually get to the point where they can sit down in front of a financier and request the money. So I wouldn't say I was a particularly good property developer. I was probably hedging my bets a little bit too much in terms of my finance career and playing around in property. And I learnt very quickly that you'd need to have a particular focus on what you're doing when you're playing in the property space. You can't hedge your bets and have a career as a finance broker and try and be a successful property developer. So, but it did teach me a lot about property development, and I think that sort of helps me sometimes talking to clients and understanding the pain and the pressure points that they've been going through. So about 6 years ago, we formed Fincierge, and that was a commitment to solely specialising in property development finance. So we don't do residential home loans or car loans or the like. We just do property development. So in the last 7 years now, coming up to our 7th year, we've grown year on year and picked up a lot of good clients, Carson and Shannon being one of them. And I think we've added quite a bit of value to our clients along the way. We're not just a property development finance broker.
Yeah.
We're here to sort of add a little bit of nous and experience to our developers and help them through that finance journey.
Well, it's such a big piece to the puzzle, right? Without finance, there's no project. Doesn't matter how good the block of land that you found, doesn't matter how good your team of consultants are. If you can't access the money, there's no deal. And with you guys, you guys aren't a small firm either, right? Like you could maybe mention, that you are maybe boutique style, but really over the last year or so, you've done about 40 development projects and just a tick over $200 million worth of lending that you guys have out there. And not only that, you guys also do some lending yourselves personally in the business as well. So it's not like you're just raising all these funds from the public and friends and acquaintances and whatnot. You're also putting your money where your mouth is, right? Which is very, very important, especially because there's two sides to your business, right? You've got the lending side, and then you've got the other side where you have the investors coming in and pooling their money and getting a return on their money to then lend it to people like Shannon and Carson to develop.
Yeah, definitely. In the last 12 months, we've predominantly financed projects privately.
Yep.
So I would estimate around the 75% were funded privately and the other 25% through traditional bank lenders. So there's definitely a balancing act from our perspective as a finance broker, and partly why we haven't gone into full-time lending is because we're here for the developer. The lending side of it evolved out of a need to fill a hole in the market that we saw. There's plenty of other lenders out there that do first mortgage lending. Second mortgage lending is a little bit more difficult to find lenders who you can trust. So from our perspective, our client is the developer.
Yeah.
So that's our goal, is to get the best possible result for our developer client, whilst balancing a decent risk, return, reward for the lender or investor.
And I want to get right into the detail of these different types of lending, because you got first mortgages, you got second mortgages, senior debt, mezzanine.
Yep.
And a lot of people that watch the podcast are going to be fairly new into the property world. So they're not going to know all these different types of finance. And to be honest with you, it's quite overwhelming for someone that is just used to going to NAB or Commonwealth or Westpac and going, hey, I need a mortgage home loan. And then they sit down in a little, cubicle office and work out your serviceability. So I want to dive deep into that shortly. But for the people what is the difference between your standard mortgage broker that you go see at NAB and Commonwealth Bank versus a property development finance broker? What's the big difference, and what do you actually do?
Okay. Big difference is expertise. So I'll put my hand on my heart and couldn't tell you the best home loan in the market, what's the best fixed rate, who offers the best serviceability calculator. I couldn't tell you that. So I would put you in touch with a residential finance broker who lives and breathes that every day. That's the similar argument on the other front. If you're a residential finance broker, you don't typically know about property development finance. You don't understand how it works. You don't understand levers that you can tweak or pull either way to make things work. It's that expertise, I think, that you just can't buy that or put a shingle on your door and say we do it. It's expertise.
Yeah. I was going to say it. I mean, for myself and Shan, we just didn't understand that space at all. It was a bit of a journey for us to try and wrap our head around that private lending world. We'd actually bought a site off a developer that had been wrapped up by a private lender. So after that, I said, I'll never use private money. And it took 2 or 3 years for me actually watching other developers having success, and realised that there's not just the loan to own sharks out there. There's some legitimate groups that are happy to fund it. And for me, that when the penny dropped was actually the fact that I didn't need serviceability. It didn't actually drop for us until like 2 or 3 years ago, where we're trying to do a little consultancy trust and each project, put some, invoice from that trust to build some serviceability to then get some integrity. That's kind of some of the way I'd been taught to actually get some serviceability. And then when that penny dropped, that if we can get some creative strategies and get some uplift in the valuation up front, we can use that to form part of our deposit. And then basically when we worked out that, hey, we don't need serviceability, if the project stacks up, they'll capitalize interest and all these things I've never heard of. So I guess it'd be good to break down, what's the fundamental difference between the private and the traditional lending when it comes to serviceability and capitalized interest. Can you touch on a couple of those items?
Yeah, just so going back a step, serviceability is a requirement from the banks when you're borrowing under the Consumer Credit Code. So many years ago, APRA came in and said, you can't lend someone money if they can't afford to pay you back. And that's typically just residential finance. So mum and dad, you're buying your home property or an investment property, you need to show that you can afford it. Property development is not consumer credit, so it's not bound by the same rules. So the banks assess those loans differently, and they don't need your serviceability to assess a property development transaction. It's nice, great, if you've got external income, but as I was alluding to earlier, it's also a weakness if you've got a full-time job, you're busting your nut to
You're right. We talk very freely on the podcast.
To earn a living, and you're taking your eyes off the prize in terms of the real goal, and that's to be a property developer. So banks look at it totally differently on a property development basis. They're looking at the project viability, they're looking at the builder, they're looking at your expertise, and they're looking at the feasibility.
And this is what people need to realize when you see a lot of these developments happening, right? Whether it's a duplex or whether it's a pack of 6 townhouses or whether it's a land subdivision of 30 to 50 lots or whether it's a high rise in the middle of, Surfers Paradise or Sydney or Melbourne. a lot of people look at that and go, wow, I wonder how they get the money to do that. Wow, they must be filthy rich. You got to be a millionaire to do these types of things. And the reality is, obviously, when you're doing it at that scale, yes, you got to be tipping in a lot of money. But when you're doing it at a small scale, if you can find the right project, like Shannon and Carson, these guys are experts at finding great pieces of land that other people get scared of, right? And then they come in and do their thing. And there's so much equity uplift, which benefits them. Like Carson said before, you know, when we start talking about buying a raw piece of land and going and getting a DA and having that equity uplift to help with the deposit, basically they're creating money from thin air based on their expertise. So I just want to explain that. If somebody buys a block of land, right, for $1 million, say Shannon and Carson, and they put it under a DD period, which is due diligence, which gives you time to actually have a look at this thing to make sure it works, or what we call stacks. And then you get, say, a 8-month settlement. By the time they go and pay the $1 million, they might have to put down a 5% deposit, right? 50 grand or a 10% deposit, depending on how good their negotiation skills are. But it's not until 8 months that they got to come up with the full $1 million. Right, which is the other 900 or 950,000. But in the meantime, they've just funded a DA, which really doesn't, you know, on something like that isn't going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So say they toss in another 50 grand, so they're in 100 grand, and they get this DA, and all of a sudden that block of land is now 3 lots, and it gets revalued at 1.5 million.
Yes.
That equity uplift, that 500 grand, from a finance point of view, is like cash.
Yep.
Within reason, right?
It's
They look at that, right, and go, okay, you've just manufactured $500,000 in equity, which is like cash in the bank, and all they've put in originally was 100 grand. And then they ring Chris and go, all right, mate, we want to take this to the next level, and we need to do civils and the rest of it, and then that's a whole different scenario. So I want to be very clear for people that don't understand equity uplift and these types of things. That's exactly how it works. That's in layman's terms.
Yep.
So kind of everybody, understands that. But let's go back to what Carson was saying, and what we were talking about is, you know, you've got different levels of debt, right? So let's start with, you've got your, you know, first mortgages. So tell me, what's the difference between a first mortgage to start with and a second mortgage on a property? And
sure.
Let's use a $1 million property as an example.
Okay. Typically, most first mortgage lenders, which we'd also call a senior lender, would lend around about 60 to 70% of the property value. So in that $1 million example, the senior lender lends $600,000. The junior lender or the mezzanine lender, second mortgage, so similar terms, would typically lend to, say, 80% of the property value. So they sit in behind the first mortgage as a secured creditor. Depending on the situation, those LVRs might go up or down slightly, but that gives you an idea. And then the developer's equity is the 80 to 100 plus percent, because you've got stamp duty and costs and things. So you're probably looking at a 30% developer contribution, 20% from the mezz, and 60% from the senior, taking you up to 110.
So would you say, when people hear of mezzanine finance and second mortgages or second tier, these types of things, they all kind of mean the same thing?
Same thing. Mezzanine,
it's just
second.
The person with the first mortgage basically has first right.
Correct.
So if that $1 million property, guys, for instance, if they've funded 600 grand, and all of a sudden that $1 million property, that developer, something happens there, they're the first ones to get paid. So if they go and they funded 600 as an example, then you have a second tier lender or a mezzanine financer that might have come in and funded another 200 grand, right? And usually that's at a lot higher interest rate because they're second in line and it's higher risk. So for that risk, I'm not going to charge you 8 or 9%, I'm going to charge you 18 and 20% because I'm second in line. If that $1 million property, something happens and it needs to be fires, there's a fire sale and the fire sale is at 700 grand. The first mortgage, right, provider gets his 600 plus probably a few fees here and there. The second mortgage the second person that has, or the company that has the second mortgage, there's only 100 grand left in the kitty, but they funded 200. So they go, well, I take that 100 and I've just burnt 100. Right. And that is why the second tier and mezz finance debt is so much more, because of the higher level of risk. But what I want people to understand is, well, when you say LVRs, right, it's the loan to value ratio. So when you look at a first mortgage lender that is a non-traditional bank, they're not going to go and give you, a full 80% like NAB is, because with NAB, they know that you can repay the loan based on your serviceability because of the interest rates at 6.5%. They're working it out at 9 or 9.5%, right? So they have that, right, and they have that buffer in there. Whereas these guys are a little bit different. They will never go up. Usually they won't go up that high because of the level of risk. Because this isn't, a brick and tile home. This is a property developer with his business hat. That's usually, quite. There's risk, right? It's calculated.
There's always
risk, right? There's always. We were talking off camera. You're telling us about a story that isn't, that doesn't always go to plan. Right? And then you got to come in and deal with those issues. So, how does, I guess, a person get to a point where they're looking at a block of land? When is a good time that they actually go, okay, I need to find someone other than an NAB or a Westpac? Like, what's the best way of finding these types of lenders? I mean, you could go on Google, of course. But
good finance broker, like Fincierge, of course. But but
I mean, if they don't know Fincierge, right? Like, we got introduced to you by Shannon and Carson, and we're working with you on a deal at the moment and working out the crux of it, right? How much needs to be put in versus second tier versus first mortgages and this type of thing. But we've got introduced to you, right?
Yes.
So how do other people find out about these second tier, third tier lenders? Because I think there's so many people that will be watching this podcast that will get their minds blown, because you've been doing this for so long and these guys have been doing it for a long time. And I've had other friends that are prominent developers that have been using this type of finance for a long time. Most people don't know there's actually an option. They just go, I've got 100 grand in my bank account. I can't afford to do anything. So I'm just not going to do anything. So how do they find out?
The key from my perspective is adding that value. So, and how do you do that? That's the hard part that I think is probably more so directed for Shannon and Carson. These guys find value and they spend a lot of time looking at sites. So it's not like you can just pick up the newspaper and look in the real estate section and find a site to buy. There are real estate portals now that are selling development sites, but typically a lot of them have some hairs on them or concerns. And if you're not experienced enough to navigate through those concerns, you're wasting your time effectively, or you're going to have to spend quite a bit of money on consultants to help them answer that question for you. So the really elite developers we come across can do that due diligence very quickly and can pass on a site almost immediately. They just know, it's intuitive, there's no money in that deal. So the key part is site identification, in my mind, and trying to find the value there. If you're spending twice what it's worth up front, then is it really worth something? You go and get your DA and now it's worth 3 or 4 times that. I've got an example, a chap in, I won't say where because it's still quite confidential, but he'd been working on a site for 2 years, met the family. It was a rural, regional type scenario. The land was rezoned. The owners didn't really weren't really aware of the rezoning or the potential of the rezoning. He approached them again and said, that number that I couldn't pay you earlier, I think I can get there now. They said, it might be another $500,000 more now. Okay, begrudgingly paid the money. He bought that site for $5 million and sold it within 4 months for $18 million. So it's not something that happened overnight. It did kind of happen in 4 months for him, and we got involved and we helped him out with some finance, but it was the site identification. And if that landowner had turned around and said, now I want 10, he probably still would have paid it.
Right. And that's why, like, we've been doing podcasts, and we've been doing these modules and different things of actually helping and teaching people what to look for in sites, because this is something that you can learn to do without any experience and without having any money. And all you got to do is learn, right? And take action by understanding what is a good site, what is not a good site, what areas, up and coming areas, looking at the seated plans and the different footprints that's always evolving and it's always changing. We had a town planner on here a couple of weeks ago, and he was explaining to us some of the new areas that he would recommend looking at just because he knows what's happening, with the city plan. And that's all good, and everyone will get excited. And then all of a sudden you get home and you need to talk to the kids, and then you got to cook, and next thing you know, you got emails to get to, and then the next day comes and you get busy. But the key is action. And this is like when Shannon and Carson and I met, like, their story, it was so engaging for me. Yes, it's a cool story, but the reality is they went out there and did the work, right? Like, Carson brought in his parents, right? Got the buy-in, went to the events, had the teas, had the coffees, hung out just to get comfortable, met people. And this is why we do this, right? So we can get people like you on. There's not many people that are coming on and saying exactly how finance broking is done from a non-traditional perspective. Because if you're sitting there and going, I have no money, right? What you can do is carve out time. And by listening to these podcasts and by joining Facebook communities and these types of things, you can learn. And once you learn and you can identify that site, like, you want to be that person that can access that $5 million site, or it might be $1 million site that could turn into $2 million, or it might be that extra, like Shannon and Carson, we broke down some of their deals, and their first deals is like 20 grand. That 20 grand makes a lot of difference to some people that actually need it. It's a difference between, like Shannon said before, a new car or a family trip, or just that level of comfort. And that's why we love doing this and talking about these opportunities.
Just to go back a step on the town planning, I think probably in my my career, it's never been as easy to identify opportunity. Particularly with the internet now. Back in the day, you'd have to go to a town planner. There was paper they'd have to read through, code, and if they didn't know it, they'd spend time to find out. But it wasn't something that felt accessible to the general public. We've got RP data. We've got all these tools now, all the PD online with a lot of the council, a lot of the zoning, a lot of the mapping, sewer, water, it's all mapped out for you. So if you're smart enough and understand the key parts to identifying the site, you don't need to rely quite so much on consultants.
Yeah. The other thing is, once you understand some of these pieces about the uplifts and stuff that you can get, you start realizing that you can offer more, because time is money. And if you can get, if Mary wants, 5 million and you offer her 5.5, she's been there for 20 years, she might wait 2 years for that 5.5, but that site, when it's DA approved, is going to be worth 8 or more. So, but that's understanding finance as much as it is just structuring a deal so you can get an approval for it. So you've got to be thinking about the finance up front. So then you can give, yourself multiple exit strategies, because if you can't get finance or for whatever reason, then you've got that uplift to on-sell it. But I want to go back and touch on finding the right broker. Once again, when me and Shannon we're cutting our teeth, we thought that all mortgage brokers did private finance, because if you ask them, they've got one or two people that do private finance. So when you're graduating into projects, it's good to know that there's a big difference between a group like what Chris is involved with Fincierge, as opposed to your mum dad broker, where they're like, yeah, we do private finance, and they got one or two people. And then because I was dealing with those groups, and they're like, this is the deal, and I was like, oh, that's not that great, or they didn't really have that many options. And then when we met with these guys, it was a completely different ball game.
And they will say yes as well. We go to a lot of brokers and developing sexy, so they'll be like, yeah, we do private funding, we can organise that.
And a basic vanilla deal, sometimes they can get them through, and we've seen it.
There's a lot more to it though. Like you said before about the service you provide for us, and it's not just a money goes in the bank, the deal's done. Like it's the whole process. You're on the whole journey with us. Like we're not finance guys. We didn't come from NAB. We can't talk like them. And every month comes around and you're talking about settlement and construction and drawdowns and quantity surveyors or engineers signing up on stuff. There's a whole process behind there as well. You're doing monthly reports. You're checking in with the financiers. You've got reporting and auditors coming out on site. And that's where these guys help you, because they speak the language. They're the barrier between us and the banker or the lender that helps us speak that language. So
they're also the barrier between our stupidity and what we don't know, and those guys, because I don't know how many times Stephen's looked at my feasibility and went, all right, well, I'll take that and put that into my feasibility and make it look pretty. And so you need these guys on your team, because
you just killed that for me. I tried to say that in a nice way without saying it was stupid.
But, when you're cutting your teeth, you need guys like this on your team, because you don't know what you don't know, right? At the end of the day, and we come from pretty low barrier to entry. I suppose we didn't know a lot about finance. So
get me out on site and on a digger, and I'd have no idea, how to operate it. So it's the same.
That's right.
Same thing. You could teach me, Shannon, I'm sure, but I'm never going to be as skillful as you at operating machinery. So I think, you do need to rely on people who know what they're talking about, and it should become pretty apparent if you're talking to a resi broker about, okay, have you got any other clients that you could put us in touch with so we can talk to you about your services?
What questions would you ask if
I was
in our shoes or in someone new and they're saying, hey, can you do this? And the broker's going, yeah, we can definitely do them.
Yep.
What questions are you asking to get through that barrier quickly?
Okay, how many development deals have you funded in the last 12 months?
Yeah.
Number-wise, what sort of dollar value would be your median or, average deal size?
To ask about the structure of the loan, what it's like, or what sort of terms do you normally get? And
getting there, yeah. So what sort of pricing, what sort of LVRs? And sometimes if you don't know it, it's difficult to ask a question around it and understand if they're full of shit or not. And frankly, there's a lot of good salesmen in any industry, and whether or not they're competent is a tough one to judge up front. I would be looking for recommendations from valuers. Have you dealt with this finance broker before? Have you seen that, or ask the finance broker, which valuers do you use? Do some DD on them. You'd like to think they're not just trying to win your business and lead you down the garden path, but unfortunately they do. There's a check there if they can make it work, so they'll try and do anything they can to make it work. But I think sniffing out existing clients that they've got. So can I talk to one of your other developer clients? I'd be happy to give you, your names to a potential new client. So why shouldn't another finance broker be able to recommend a client that they've actually done a good job for? Go and talk to these guys. They'll tell you how my service is. Word of mouth is a big thing, I think, and that's how our business is really formed. We've not spent a lot of money on marketing, and we're not out there beating the beat to try and find new deals. It's more organically coming in through our good work. And if you need to Google a finance broker, you'll get the guy who's paid the most to be at the top of the list.
Yeah.
Basically.
And I think you just got to resonate with that person as well, right? Like have that gut feel. You know, we got introduced to you by Shannon and Carson, and again, word of mouth, right? And we got introduced, and we knew other, lenders, and there was, emails flying around and back and forth and bits and pieces, and we just resonated with you. Like you knew what you're talking about. You're up front. And some of these other guys, it just felt like there was pressure tactics, like
Totally.
you need, like they were kind of like you need me more than I need you, kind of thing. Like they're doing us a favor, and I was just like the level of arrogance that came across. I'm just like, I don't care if you were that much cheaper. I wouldn't even go with you. I would pay someone else more because I don't want to have to deal with that level of arrogance. So. Again, asking the right questions is one thing, but we knew we were going to meet you, right? So it's the face-to-face. It's, hey, catching up with the financing. Yes, come down. All right, let's go to the site. Let's grab lunch. Spending that time together and getting a better understanding and asking those questions. Most lenders aren't going to go and do a $3, $4, $5, $10 million deal with you without meeting you, walking the site, asking questions, doing some background checks. Who are these guys? What are they doing? Like, I remember when we were speaking, you're like, you must be a good guy. You guys must be good guys if you've been referred by Shannon and Carson, right? Like if I was referred by someone that did a dirty on you, you're going to be like, okay, yeah, I really don't want to deal with this person, because if you're surrounding yourself with that person, you're going to put them in that same bucket. So I think it's very, very important just to build that relationship.
Totally.
We're doing here.
Our whole business is based on relationships. And frankly, if a lender or a broker doesn't want to meet you or doesn't want to visit the site and is showing not a lot of interest, then you're just a number for him, and he's already moving on to the next deal. Yeah. We have a fairly small number of clients. We're looking for clients with a repeat pipeline of who are full-time developers. So I can understand some of the bigger brokerages out there being a bit more arrogant in that regard and treating you like a number. But I'd encourage the people out there to find a broker who is willing to put in a little bit of time to develop that relationship. He should want to do it with you, not just the other way around.
Chris, the other thing I wanted to pick your brain was one of the things that we struggled with I struggled with particularly, was interest rates. I was like, I want to get the cheapest interest rate. I don't know how many people you come across where it's all about the interest rate, to the point where I was happy doing joint ventures and giving away 50% of my profits, because I was like, oh, we're getting a cheap interest rate. I'm giving away 50% of my profits. And then I realized I can pay 13% interest or more. It's a lot cheaper than giving away half my profits away. And it took me years to even for that penny to drop, that it's not just about the interest rate. It's about how you structure the deal. Because a lot of people are raising that mezzanine and giving away a lot of profits there and a profit share. But if you can structure it in a way where, you're putting in what you need to and you're paying that higher interest rate, it's a cheap joint venture part at the end of the day. But do you find people get hung up on the interest rate?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Some people, just focus solely on the interest rate. And, with that example is a perfect example, and we see it all the time. And we're probably fortunate in the last few years where projects have gone really well. So you want to keep the development upside. You want to keep the profit upside. So if you lock in a fixed interest rate or return for your joint venture partner, even though they may be a mezzanine lender, that 15 or 20 or 25% you're paying them is fixed. So if things go bad, then you're still up for that 15, 20%, which means, if there's no profit, you're having to find that money elsewhere. But, in the last, 6 or 7 years, we haven't had any issues with capital values declining. So your profit upside has been huge. So if you lock in a fixed return and then all of a sudden your project's way more profitable than you thought, that's in your pocket, not your fixed return mezzanine lender. So yes, if you can then do the same thing with a private on a senior basis, and we've got one at the moment, I was explaining to you earlier, private lenders come in to fund a $32 million transaction because the developer couldn't achieve the pre-sale requirement for the bank. So the bank said, we want 50% debt cover. He couldn't get there. He'd already started construction. He's coming out of the ground. He's put all of his money in to get to this point. He needs a solution. He doesn't want to go and spend 7 or 8% with marketing channels to move the product quickly. And he still thinks at the back end, in 12 months' time, when he's finished, the capital values will have increased. So you add a couple of those combining sort of effects together, and all of a sudden his profit at the end might be a couple of $1 million more, but he's having to pay private money, which might cost him $500,000 or $750,000 more than the bank, but he's got better terms. He's been able to not have to sell as much product and hopefully get the upside out the back end.
Yeah.
So,
I guess the fear with private lending, though, is when it does go bad, because the time frames are a lot shorter. You got your 12 months, not like your 30-year loan where you can just keep paying. So what obviously with COVID, there was a lot of bills that didn't go on time.
Yeah.
What happens if you get to the 12 months and you haven't paid back the bank? Are they just going to pull the rug out from underneath you, or you got your default interest? Like, how does that negotiation happen? Because I'm sure you've been through plenty of.
Yeah, we have.
How do you find the difference between bank and private lending?
Private's a lot. They're more concerned, frankly, because the bank, going back a step, traditionally are relying on your ability to service that debt. So if the project hasn't gone according to plan, you're not ready to start, then the bank doesn't necessarily care because they're still relying on you to pay the interest. Private lenders are capitalising the interest, so that loan that started at 60% day one, at the end of 12 months might be close to 70%. So can they extend again for another 12 months and you guys not pay any interest and go to 80%? Possibly not.
Can you explain capitalized interest for those that don't know? Because everyone's just used to going, all right, I either got a variable home loan or I got a, principal and interest home loan, and they know I'm paying 6.5%. And if I've got $1 million loan, 6.5% variable is $65,000 in interest, and you're getting charged that interest every month.
Yeah.
And if you don't pay that interest, you're going to be getting a text message or you're going to be getting a phone call, right, from the bank saying what's going on.
Yeah.
So what does capitalized interest even mean? Because this is something that I've known about for a long time, but when I first heard about it, I was like, this is pretty cool, because the big thing is, if I don't have money, right, if someone's going to a deal and not having money, they can either raise money by equity or debt, and they need to understand that the interest, this component, doesn't have to be paid straight away.
That's right. So using the 30 mil project, no one really would be able to show servicing on a $30 million project, right? What do you need? $3 or $4 million at least in income to service that. So the banks understand that, and they know that there's no income coming out of the project until the very end, until all the property's been sold. So they get the fact that you can't service the interest. So they just allow that interest to add on each month. So at the end of the month, you've got an interest bill for $50,000, that gets added to the principal. And then the next month you're paying interest on the interest that you accumulated last month. So it can have a compounding effect, particularly if the interest rate's quite high. You might start at 10%, but at the end of the loan term, you're effectively paying sort of nearly 11 with the capitalised and compounding effect of interest. So
that's where you're saying the LVR is getting out of balance because they need their return plus their interest. So it's
and if you keep capitalising, at some point, the music stops and the lender is going to want his money back.
In simple terms, like they loan you the interest. You know, like
Yes.
that
Yeah.
was just a new concept that blew my mind as well. So that they give me the interest and then just draw down on it as you have the loan. So you're not putting your hand out of your pocket every single
Most
week.
lenders
So-
won't actually physically give you the interest, so you can go to the track and
No, of
That's
course
right.
not.
It's in it.
race 3, number 4. It's there as a reserve.
Yeah.
And they draw that down to pay themselves effectively.
So for those that don't know, where does this money actually come from? So obviously you have banks,
Yep.
right? And they have a huge vault, right?
Mm.
Well, not really anymore, but they have access to plenty of funds.
Yeah.
With private lending, where does the actual money come from?
So we would probably classify private lending into 3 distinct groups. So first group would be the institutional money. Google metrics at the moment, they're having a tough time with ASIC. They're probably one of the biggest private non-bank lenders in the country.
Did you Google metrics?
Metrics.
Oh, metrics, sorry.
METRICS.
Yep.
Metrics.
Yep.
And they basically raise money off of other banks and superannuation funds. So that's where their capital is coming from.
Yeah.
That would be the top tier of private lending. And then we would have what we would call the family office arrangement, where you've got billionaires or multi-millionaires who like private credit and like the direct relationship with the developer, not going through one of those institutional firms we just mentioned. So there's quite a few of them out there that have really pivoted towards private credit and set up little, businesses within their family offices to facilitate that. And then at the very bottom end is, the lower end of that family office, and maybe including syndicated sort of arrangements. So that could be, the traditional loan shark, who's out there to charge turbo rates. He doesn't care about whether or not he's necessarily going to get repaid. Sometimes it's a numbers game for them, and
Comes out in the wash at the end.
they'll charge you 50% and give you 3 weeks to pay back. And if it doesn't, it compounds, and all of a sudden you're up for mega bucks. And then there's, reputable people, and a lot of the people that invest with us are ex-property developers or have been in the property game, who've sort of retired. They understand property. They want a passive investment, and they participate in some of our loans.
You mentioned before with your client, the $30 million loan that you did, the pre-sales side of things. Can you touch on pre-sales a little bit with what banks require, what private lenders require, and what the difference is there? Because some may require full debt coverage, some might not require any pre-sales at all. And you did touch on the uplift there, but what's the balancing act, I suppose?
Yeah. Well, the bank standard line is you need pre-sales. 100% is great. That'll get you in the front door with every bank. For a period of time there, CBA was sort of looking for 110% debt cover because they were thinking some were going to drop off by the time they settle. Look, the last 4 or 5 years, again, that with the big asset value increases, most pre-sales are happening. So at the back end, people are picking up money. They're creating that equity by buying 2 years ago, and now the market's moved. That 3-bedroom apartment for 900's now 1.5. So they've created equity that way. Go back to the GFC, and those people buying a 3-bedroom apartment for 900,000. When it came time to settle, that apartment was only worth 700,000, and so people were falling off, handing over the deposit, taking the risk of being sued by the developer, and walking away. And that scared the shit out of the banks, frankly, because they're relying on those people settling. So it's definitely lightened up in the last few years. I think ASIC have come out earlier this year and said, it might have been the the Treasurer came out and said, we need the banks to loosen up here. APRA have basically instilled a higher capital value to those loans, so the bank needs to put more capital aside to be able to lend that out to property developers. So,
guys, I know this is an ad, but trust me, you want to watch this one because it is an absolutely ripping product for anybody who uses a computer. One of the things I hate the most in business is email and responding to YouTube comments on my computer here. This AI app is a game changer. What it does is it enables me to never type another email again. I'm going to show you how it works, but essentially, instead of typing, I have a key on my computer that I just push the key, I start talking, it dictates everything I said and uses AI to correct any words that it hears after I've trained it a few times where there's misspelling, and it just cuts my email response time in half and enables me to give much deeper, better emails to people. Just check this out. As soon as you see it, you'll see how it works. If you want to get it, there's a link beneath this video. It is insane. It's called Whisper AI. It's a game changer. Let me show you. So this is a scene you've all seen before, writing an email, but instead of going and writing and using my keys here to type in, I'm just going to push that little FN button and I'm going to read this straight in here. So watch this. Hi there, thanks for watching the podcast. Have a great day. Let it go. Boom, there it is, and I hit send. That's it, guys. Click on the link below the video. Get signed up today. It will save you heaps of time. All my entrepreneurial friends are using it. You can thank me later. Let's get back to the pod.
they can lend out to a home loan and they might have $1 of capital, and they can lend out, say, $100 to home loan lenders. Under a property development capital allocation, it's probably $1 to $10 out the door. So from their perspective, it's become less and less profitable. They have to allocate more capital. So they really only look for, the gold-plated deal. So hence why they're looking for higher pre-sales. They've started to come back now because we've seen price escalation during that construction phase of COVID. Builders were going broke. If the bank and the developer didn't support the builder, the project falls over, so it creates a bigger problem. So they've got to provide those cost overruns or escalation. And how do you do that? Hopefully your values have gone up, and 9 times out of 10 they have in the last few years. So, but what happens in the next few years, I'm not too sure. But to go back to the pre-sale question, we're probably seeing banks comfortable at 50%. Some banks will do no pre-sales for the right product mix. They're a little bit particular. Some like land, some like townhouses. Private lenders, it's totally negotiable, really, depending on the lender. So most of the time they're looking for market acceptance and want to believe that the property is worth what the valuer is saying it is and what the developer thinks he can sell it for.
That's why we went down that way with yourself and private lending a couple of times as well. Yeah. It's the pre-sale requirements, because bush is hard to sell. Yes. And the ripple effects of sunset clauses and what's happened in that scenario, and you've been involved in selling stuff off the plan, that still affects us now. So we've got quite a few pre-sales on one of our projects now, and one of the big hinging factors, or people get trust there, is because we have a project around the corner that we've done and completed, so they can see a finished product, and that's helping Carson with sales out there.
It's funny because when you look at the whole pre-sale, right, I think more and more developers are looking at trying to get less and less pre-sales because of that uplift gain. And I think a lot of that has come from COVID, because there's a lot of developers, that sold, and then obviously values have increased. So I think moving forward, there's a lot more developers trying to retain as much as possible. Not that we're going to get COVID level increases, I don't think, anytime soon in that short period of time. But when you start looking at the demographics and different areas and what's happening in supply and demand constraints, this all adds to the story, right? Especially where you guys would be lending. If I came to you and said, hey, I'm in Melbourne right now and I'm doing this in Melbourne versus Gold Coast, you guys are probably going to be looking at things a little bit differently, just because of the market in Melbourne and people fleeing there and selling and what they've done with the taxes and whatnot. So how does how does a funder like yourself, we always talk about a town planning, going, use a town planner that's in your area. If you're buying on the Gold Coast, use a town planner from the Gold Coast, not one from Tasmania or Melbourne or Sydney, because they'll most likely know the town planning a lot better here. How does it work with finance? Like, obviously you're based in Noosa. Whether you're based in Noosa, do you guys finance anywhere around the country, or do you guys have a pocket that you want to stay?
Yeah, Southeast Queensland typically.
Why?
Because we're close and we can actually get in front of the developer easily.
Is there any other reasons from a belief perspective going?
No,
Southeast Queensland,
not really.
Risk factor?
Not really. It's just where we are, and it is the industry has become more and more competitive. So it's difficult for me to bring up a Sydney developer and promote our services from Noosa. So we do go from northern New South Wales up to North Queensland. We've done quite a bit in regional Queensland, but the majority of our work is Southeast Queensland.
Yeah. So if we're going to pitch a project to you, if someone's starting out and they might have done a couple little projects here and there, maybe a duplex or a triplex, and done it and under the traditional finance pathways, and then they're struggling to say they've got a 10-lot subdivision. How should we as developers be pitching the deal to you? If it's the first time we've come to you and we've got this project, do we come to you with just a feasibility, or should we have like an IM on the project? What's your ideal client, and how should a deal, to give them the best chance of you actually even taking them seriously to start with, how should a deal be presented?
So have I got my lender hat on or my broker hat on here, Cuz?
Your broker hat.
Broker hat.
Yeah.
Totally different story. We'd always say early engagement is better.
Okay.
We feel like we can add a bit of value, set you on the right path, and guide you through that process to become construction ready, finance ready. In saying that takes us a bit more time. So it'd be great if you could come to us with a nice glossy IM with all of the information presented in one package. But that's essentially what we do for our clients and how we pitch the project to lenders and investors. So we're doing our due diligence on your due diligence and bundling it together. We don't go to the full length of presentation. We're not getting a publishing company to come in and gloss it all up, but like you would see a professional IM from a capital raiser, for example. But it is a detailed paper, and we don't necessarily expect that from developers. We'd like the baked cake, but we understand you're typically going to give us the ingredients and we'll bake it for you, right?
How much due diligence are you doing? Because I'm assuming you've seen plenty of feasibilities where you're like, this doesn't stack up. So like, how much are you cross-checking and looking at values, or is that your job?
You mentioned Stephen earlier. We've got a couple of very good people with Excel skills, obviously, that can pick holes in any errors. But yeah, we go and jump on RP data, have a bit of a look around the area. How much have you paid for the site? Look at your feasibility and sale prices. Does that look realistic? Do your construction costs look realistic? We can't really guide, but we can typically identify things that look out of whack. Yeah. So that construction cost looks way too cheap compared to something we saw, 2 weeks ago for a similar product.
So even end values on properties, people will typically put in the highest value they've seen in the area.
Yep,
not
totally.
go for the in-between or the lowest.
Yeah, and we typically do some stress testing on the feasibility ourselves to understand, well, okay, if the valuation doesn't come in at $1 million a box, comes in at 900, what does that do to the financing? And it can have a very big impact. So, that early engagement with your finance broker should also probably happen with your valuer, and the sales agents in your area. So you, as a developer doing your due diligence, you should be gathering all that same information that the lender wants in order to decide whether or not you want to go ahead with it. You want to put your money in. So
the way I look at it, if you're not doing that, you shouldn't be buying the site anyway. So they shouldn't even be at that point.
That's right.
Now, Carson said it earlier, loan to own, right? And I think this is the big fear of private lending. Everyone's heard a horror story, right?
Yeah.
When you have an issue paying your loan off at NAB or Westpac or ANZ or any of these big banks, they'll ring you or they'll text you, and they're not going to rip the house right from underneath you straight away, right? They're going to try and work with you and give you extensions and lower payments and, capitalize some interest maybe, they're willing to negotiate. And that's one of the things that I've always thought about, because I've heard of many people in the past, basically losing their shirts to private lenders and this whole loan to own. And basically what that means, guys, is exactly what it says is, basically funders that are out there that, whether it's on purpose or not, structure a deal well knowingly that, right, you're not going to be able to execute it, and they're going to come halfway through and take it. Now, we just make that up, right? I'm not saying that there's lenders that are out there that actually do this on purpose, but the fear is real, right? How do people know? What questions should they ask? Like, just to know that they're dealing with someone that is there for the right interest. Like, obviously, we're trying to work in partnership together. We want to make as much as we can. You want to protect your money and your client's money, and there's an executed deal there, right? So what can some people do, or what are the things that you look for to make sure that, Chris from Concierge isn't one of those guys, as an example?
Yeah.
A Fincierge, sorry.
We get that. So if I maybe just go back a step in terms of asking about a good finance broker. So we've seen mandates from finance brokers that have a caveatable interest over the property should you not pay their fee. So I think that's BS, frankly. If you can't trust your client enough, then why are you entering into an arrangement? And similarly, if you're the borrower, why would you ever want a caveatable interest over your property? But some lenders do the same thing. So there are warning signs that will give you a feel for a lender not being potentially, upfront.
And what do you mean by caveat?
A caveat. So a caveat, that's an instrument.
Let's use an example. Let's use, again, for the people that don't know what it is or how it works, let's use that $1 million property that you're going to a second tier lender for the money.
Yeah. So if I was a second tier lender and the first mortgage lender wouldn't allow me to register my second mortgage on the property, I might say, okay, I still want to do the loan. So I'll give you the loan, but you have to give me a caveat or caveatable interest in the property. So if I don't get repaid or I panic at any point in time, I can go and whack that caveat down on the property, and I've got roughly 90 days before it'll drop off. And that should trigger some action between the lender and the borrower to pay me.
It's almost
you
like
can't sell the property.
That's right. It's almost like an insurance. So basically, if you're the owner of the property, right, the PTY that's bought it, and someone slaps a caveat on it, you're stuck. Like there's nothing you can do. And the reason for that is, if that person didn't have a caveat and you're dealing with a bad person, they can go and try and do a side deal somewhere, get paid, and then all of a sudden run off to Mexico, never be seen again. And the second second tier lender just is sitting there going, I've just lost my money that I've put in.
Yeah.
Whereas that caveat is an insurance. But what you're saying is, if you're talking to brokers and lenders and they're mentioning that they want to put these types of caveat instruments, it'll be in the terms and conditions probably somewhere, just to be a little bit weary.
Yes.
So one of the questions that would be great to ask is there any caveat interests in this deal that we're talking about? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Cool.
And look, some lenders are only doing that to protect their fees if you pull out. And there are reputable lenders that structure their deals that way. So I'm not suggesting that's the
You can't blame them in some instances, especially
totally.
especially if you're dealing with a client that might not have the best track record or is green.
Or they're talking to 4 different brokers
Correct.
and 5 different lenders, and they're trying to find the best deal. But
Yeah.
in actual fact, they're making it worse for themselves most of the time, because some of those lenders and brokers will cross paths, and when they find out that, you're shopping not only the brokerage but the lending business, then you're losing a bit of credibility and trust in that relationship piece. So, but to go to the loan to own question, we haven't really seen a lot of it, to be honest.
Okay.
It's when you say predatory lending, it's more so there's an opportunity to sink the boot in and get a higher interest rate.
Yeah.
It is really difficult, and we've only had one instance in our 10 odd years of lending where we've had to take possession of a property. The borrower couldn't pay us back. The first mortgage lender took possession. We were in the second mortgage position, and we ended up taking a loss on that, right? So, but the tough part about it was that, we had a mortgage and we had to release it for him to sell, and we had a guarantee from the developer to pay us back if there was any shortfall. But, he has basically slipped off to Mexico, and, it is really hard in that situation to actually make it profitable for yourself. And there's a lot of legislation around what the process you need to do as mortgagee in possession to sell the property for the right price to an external party, etc. So it's very difficult to fudge that game. And if lenders are out there trying, good luck to them, frankly.
I mean, it's all risk, right? Like, you guys are trying to reduce your risk just like anyone else in any businesses. But let me tell you, I've been involved in a lot of different businesses, and every single one of those businesses, there's people that owe us money. So, it's just the game.
Yeah.
And it comes out in the wash. You're not going to get paid 100% of the time in any business. If that was the case, right, everybody would be in business, right? There's no such thing, exactly, as a bulletproof business. I want to touch a little bit on debt versus equity, because this is something that we're working through at the moment. And I know Shannon and Carson, on some of the deals that they did, gave away 85% of the equity, 75% of the equity, 60% of the equity. And as they went on, they gave away less and less and less. And I'm even throwing my hat in the ring sometimes. Hey, don't forget about me, But the reality is, they don't need me, or they don't need that person anymore if they don't want to, because they got Fincierge and they're becoming finance experts. And a friend of mine who's a mentor, he's like, the last 12 to 18 months, I have become a finance expert in my developing business. Yeah. I've learned more in the last 18 months around finance than anything else, which is amazing. And that's one of the things that I said this year. I want to become, I shouldn't say an expert, but very well rounded in regards to this topic and how things work in this world, because it's like business. I hear, because we do business coaching and different things, and people give away equity like it's Skittles. Like, it's just, come in, I'll give you 25%, or I'll give you this chunk, or they're not thinking long term, right? And equity is usually the most expensive, right? Because at the beginning, you're always going to give away the most.
Yeah.
Shannon and Carson, perfect examples. Now, this could be a question for Shannon or Carson, or yourself, Chris. Where do you draw the line in the sand going, yes, I'm going to give away equity? Because do you guys feel like giving away equity is less risk in a way, because you're going, well, that equity partner is taking on more risk now, rather than us going and getting a second tier lender with a first mortgage, and then a second mortgage, and then, even a third on the back of it, and then, default interest rates, and like, you got to sleep at night at the end of the day, right? So sometimes I think people go, you know what, I'm happy reducing the risk. I'm going to give away 30% to that guy so he could fund a little bit, and I don't have to go. I was going to say something, but I can't say that. Really deep into the deal. So Is there a right answer or a wrong answer? Or is it
I think you're going to get two different answers here out of how we structure it and why we go a different way.
I'd love to hear both.
Yeah.
I think for us, we like to sleep at night and we love what we do. So for one, we've had people come to us and offer us stupid amounts of money, and we've left that meeting and me and Shannon gone, they're going to own us, and they're going to, we like to be in partnerships where people respect what we're bringing to the table, and we're happy to share in that. So for us, we look at it like we can try and do, we've got like 3 projects at the moment. For us to do another 3 of the same size would take us out of our risk profile of what we're prepared. We could probably massage it, but then would be skin. We like to keep a bit of money to the side for a rainy day if things go wrong. So if I was bringing in someone to give away an equity share now, for example, yourself, I found a decent deal and you're willing to put up all of the cash and I'm not putting in any of the cash, I'm willing to do 50-50 because not every single deal you can structure it and get that uplift on the valuation.
That's right.
We've done a few of those and that's great if you can do it, but the majority of the time you can't. So I'm happy to give away 50% if someone's bringing in the money piece, so we can sleep at night and know that we're not, because we had another deal recently, which is just going to market. It needed to be serviced. We had to hold it. We couldn't use private money, and we didn't know when we were going to get the approval. So we needed to settle on it. It was going to take 3 years roughly to get the DA because it was over the border. So we needed someone to be able to service a loan, and so we pitched the deal as, hey, this is what's going to happen. We're buying it really, really well. The upside's great, but we needed to find something that can service a loan. So they needed to be rewarded for taking that risk because they're taking a risk as well, and we still don't have any skin in the game. They deserve 50%. I think a lot of developers we talk about, you shouldn't have K, but you've got to respect the money. And I think that's where a lot of developers go wrong, because if you're in the shoe on the other foot, I want a caveat. I want to protect my own interests. So you've got to be thinking about, and I feel like where I've seen it go wrong in development is when people are bringing in poor mum, dad, and they're sitting in a trust with no security over their money. And I mean, you've seen it, Chris, and I've seen it. And we could talk about we won't drop names, but there's some disaster stories out there where people haven't got the right security and lost millions and millions and millions of dollars. So, I'm going on a tangent. I lost my train of thought, but
no,
so, yeah,
it's good because that's because there's a thing called greed. Right. And we always think that everything's going to go up in value and we're going to make all this money. But GFC times have happened. I know people that walked away from $300,000-$400,000 deposits that bought in certain buildings in Broad Beach at the time, handed the keys back and wiped the $300,000-$400,000 and said, if you want to chase me, come chase me. Yeah. But guess what? A lot of other people are doing the same thing. And, the developer's probably not going to chase everybody because they're already going to be in strife at the same time. So we have to really be conservative, right? And as developers, you want to, some developers, especially, new developers, they want to start putting stuff in the feasibility like uplift in future uplift. And I'm not talking about the potential uplift on the value of the property with a DA versus non-DA. That's okay to have in there, right?
Yeah.
But we're selling in 2 years.
Yeah.
And in 2 years, surely these things are going to go from 1.5 to 1.8. That's 300 grand. And 300 grand times 10 is 3 million bucks. That is what you don't want to do. I always tell people, what you're trying to do in the feasibility is talk yourself out of the deal. Please tell me not to buy this thing. That's the way I look at it, right? Yeah. And if you protect yourself in a way where you're being conservative and the numbers still look good or great, that's amazing. But put overs on there, right? Like if agent fees are, you can sell them yourself, don't put 0. Put 3% plus GST on there, right? Put the 500 grand in agents fees and marketing it's going to cost, because if something happens, you're going to have to do that. Don't rely on just because I have a real estate license and I'll just throw this on REA and spend 5 grand on a project, 7.5 grand on a project profile, and within 3 months I'll sell it and it's going to cost me nothing. In the future, if you do that, that's fine. But when you're doing the feasibility, build that thing up to make sure, because the reality is Chris is going to do the same thing, right?
Yeah.
No financier is going to give you the money with fake numbers.
Yeah, that's right. You should be stress testing, and fair point if you want to put a bit of escalation in your sale prices, but
Yeah.
at the same time, you should be doing the same thing with your construction prices.
Agree.
Right? So it's not just all blue sky.
Agree.
So, a good feasibility will give you that ability to tweak a few of the levers and understand the critical point of where you do want to be.
Shannon, you mentioned you thought there was going to be two different answers on the debt and equity. Was that from Carson and yourself, or from Carson and Chris?
No, from us too. So we position ourselves now more as the long-term hold, like Carson was saying. So if there's something that's a long-term hold, that's not our strategy at the moment. We can't do that. But I imagine Chris will have a different answer as to why.
Yeah, look, I think it's really deal specific and also developer dependent. Like if you've got cash, we have some developers who like to have a big pipeline, and so they've got cash, but they're looking for the next one, and they're looking to pull money out of this one so they can go into the next one. But it's very difficult to line up a pipeline and get it right in terms of delivery and timing. So at some point, there's a hole that needs to be filled. That hole typically is better filled by debt, but if you're a new developer coming into the game, and we've got one at the moment, he's partnered up with a family office and said, I'm happy to give away whatever it is, because I'm going to build a business here that will feed me and my kids for the next 30 years. So I'm not too worried about the upfront equity right now. I'm looking at a bigger picture.
long term?
So, yeah, but we've seen, guys that go and give away equity unnecessarily, and we try and advise against it, and they're just happy to take, hey, I just want him in my corner with me. I don't want to feel like he's a lender and we're competing. I just want, we're going to sit down at the PCGs and go and do meetings together and feel like a partner.
What's a PCG?
Project Control Group.
Okay.
So typically that would be something during the project where the developer, the builder, lender, project manager, engineer, whoever, consultants might come along and talk about the project on a monthly basis.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Got a question for you that we haven't really touched on, but it's probably one of the most critical ones. Is when's the deal a deal? Like, what is the profit on cost, or what's the percentage that developers are making? Like, I know, pre-COVID, it was probably a certain number as well, and it's probably come down a little bit now. I mean, we typically go for sites that have got a few more hairs on it, so we're needing bigger margins, and obviously the more risk if you're building high rises and the like, you're going to want bigger margins. But for the typical private lender or bank, what's the magic number for when they'll fund it?
It's funny, a lot of people ask me that, but it's actually not, it's neither. It's the valuer that you need to convince, because the valuer is the one who's doing the assessment on your feasibility, who's providing a report to the bank or the private lender to, verify your numbers. So the valuer will work backwards on your feasibility to determine, and the percentages have changed a little bit over the years, but it's typically between 15 and 20% profit margin or on cost. Yeah. So if you're not in that bandwidth, as in you're below it, they'll reduce the value of your land so that you get within that bandwidth. And similarly, when you guys, and you've seen the upside of it, when there's so much more profit in there than 15 to 20%, it's sitting at 40, 50, 80%, that's where they increase the land value to get back to that 15 to 20% bandwidth.
It's all about being conservative, right?
So that, and the way they're looking at it is, okay, if the developer falls over, what would another developer come in and pay for this site? And what profit margin would he need to see to make it worth the risk? Depending on the numbers, but as a developer, if you're getting a 25% profit margin on your project, you should be making 100% of your equity capital back as a profit. So that gives you a bit of leeway to know that, okay, I'm going to get my initial cash back. That's number one. You don't want to lose that. But there's still enough profit margin there for you to make $1 out of it.
And through that process there, where you were saying before, that not having agents commission in there, that's where that's all going to come undone, or that needs to be in there.
Yeah, well, that was part of our advice to you, Shannon. You were coming in too cheap on your civil works. And it's like, mate, you've got to put it up, because a valuer is going to look at that and say, well, you're a related party. And if I have to go out to one of the big civil firms to do this job because you fall over or break your leg or you're not playing anymore, what's it going to cost from the lender's perspective to finish the job? And anyone else isn't going to do it on a 0% profit margin like you might. So, yeah, definitely build in your value of your time into your feasibility.
Yeah.
What are some of the biggest mistakes that you see new property developers making? We're not talking about the seasoned guys like the Shannon and the Carsons.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking about the ones that are, you know, got a bit of a syndicate together. They got a few mates, you know, they've been learning off Shannon and Carson and Unemployable, and they're putting a site together, and they've been introduced to, you know, to Chris as an example, or that I love the smile, because there's a lot of these.
No.
So
you've basically just made me think of myself,
Yeah.
to be honest.
Yeah.
What are the mistakes I've made? And I can't talk too much about other people, but I know what I've mucked up in the past.
And can you open up on that?
Yeah, well, first one was a joint venture with an engineering person, and he had an engineering firm, and he had a town planner that he'd brought on within his team, and we were going to do some projects. The town planner found a site that was related to the engineering department, and thought we could get 4 levels on the site, and went through a process of development applications and got to the point where the council said yes in the pre-lodgement, submitted the plans, information requests. It had to go for notification, and one of the neighbours appealed basically and said you shouldn't have 4 levels, it should only be 3. So the DD part was wrong up front. We paid too much for the site based on what we thought we could get.
So when they appealed it and they advertised it, just so everyone knows, there's 2 different types of applications that you could do. One is called code accessible, and one is called impact accessible. Now, code accessible is basically within the parameters of what you're allowed to do in that site, based on the zoning and density requirements that council allows you. That's a lot less risk. So if it says you can build up to 9 meters and you can have, you know, X amount of bedrooms per square meter, you're within that, you're good likelihood that you're going to get a tick of approval. And then you get, you know, you put your big boy pants on and you try and get creative and go, you know, I'm going to try, you know, there's more than one way to skin a cat here. I want to get an extra level, or I want to get an extra, unit on this thing. And you go, and you're basing your feasibility off getting that.
Yes.
And you overpaid for the site because you're going, actually, we're not going to get 4 on here. We're going to squeeze 5. And in your case, that didn't happen. So
the other way.
With impact accessible, what you got to do is, you know, those signs when you're walking down the street and you see kind of the sign in front of a property, and it's got all this small little writing, and it's got, you know, the council emblem, and it's got a photo of a render of what's actually going to be going there. That's what they're doing. They're advertising. And what happens with that is you've got Mrs. Jones down the road that's been living there for 30 years, and you got the neighbor, and you've got shadowing, and you've got noise, and all of a sudden you get some appeals and finished.
Yeah. Yep. Well,
that's a very good one.
Around the same time that Brisbane City Council were copping a bit of heat around their townhouse policy, their infill policy, and there was an election coming up. So we had a perfect storm of political pressure to not approve the deal. Anyway, we're still going in that. That's 8 years now.
Wow.
We've sold 2 of the properties that were in that project, and we've got 1 left to sell. So
it works now because of the land uplift.
Well, finally, yeah, that's right. We had to sit on it for a couple
of
years and just do nothing and hope that things worked out. And that's not a great place to be as a property developer. You're tying up a cash for no return,
Yeah.
possibly a negative return, and you can't get out of it unless you crystallize that loss. So, that was a big mistake. Yeah, poor DD up front, not enough profit margin, and we're still
Pushing the
going.
boundaries.
Yeah.
So if you had to go do another deal now, what would you be doing? So if you were to, you see a lot of townhouses,
Take a swig of that water.
subdivisions, luxury duplexes, you've funded them all. So risk versus reward, because obviously some look very sexy when you're looking at the numbers, but you're taking on a lot more risk. Two questions then. So one, for the first person starting out, what do you think is the best and safest deal for someone cutting their teeth? And what do you think is the best strategy for risk versus reward?
Right now, anything that doesn't require building. You guys may not know, but we've got small townhouse developers that are getting quoted 5 to 10 grand from builders to even look at it, basically.
Yeah, right.
And that's to provide a quote. So, there's still a lot of work after that to refine the drawings to a point where they can quote accurately and actually give you a proper price. But they want you to pay for them to get to that point now. So it makes it difficult if you're a new developer to go, well, how do I build this thing, and where do I find a reputable builder who isn't going to fall over? Because that's a whole nother set of problems if that happens. And that's one of the other mistakes I made, picking a wrong, in distress builder who fell over halfway through the project, and bringing another builder in to finish cost us, another couple $100,000 more than our original feasibility. So, yeah, you'd need to be very careful at the moment with any built form. That would be a big caution for mine, unless you've got a builder in that and respect, and can help you
build a developer yourself.
Yeah, and that might be one where you partner up with a builder developer. You've found the site. You go, I think it's a good site, but I need you to come in here and deliver this project and reduce my downside risk of getting the feasibility wrong. So, the best deals we're seeing now are sort of tick and flick type things where you can get something under contract, and before you're due to sell, you sell your option on. That's a great way to, know very little money down and pick up some upside. Small splitters, I think, are probably the best way to go for a new person. Find a big site where you can throw a second duplex or something on the back or to the side. But that's still exposing yourself to construction risk, which escalation's still happening right now. So no one really knows where that's going to stop.
What happens when the project is finished? So you guys don't do traditional lending.
Yep.
So you build, the duplex, you fund the duplex through construction. Construction is finished. You've been paid.
Yep.
What does that developer now have to do? So for instance, we'll use a scenario. I'm a developer, right? I've found a great site. I've done the due diligence, right? I've DA'd it. I've got the uplift. I've done a deal with Chris, but I don't have income. I've lost my job.
Yep.
Job is finished. What happens? How do I refinance this project? Or do I just, because it takes time to sell, right?
Yes.
Like if I can't refinance it and go, I want to keep one, I got to sell it, but it's going to take time to sell. And you might have only gave me the deal for 18 months. We're now 19 months.
Yeah, there's a secondary market in lending for what they'd call residual stock.
Yeah.
So anything that's unsold.
Yeah.
It's almost like site finance at the front end. It's virtually a no questions asked 60% lend against the value of the property.
Yeah.
On the basis that the borrower is a corporate entity, not an individual.
Okay.
because that brings in the consumer credit side of it. So, a few years ago now, pre-COVID, there was a lot of residual stock, so developers couldn't sell everything off the plan. Settlement comes and goes on the first wave, and they're sitting there with 10, 15, 20 apartments. There's lenders out there that love that stuff. It's passive lend, and there's sales eventually coming in to reduce the debt over time. So but you've got to finance it, and there's holding costs, and you've got land tax rates, everything else, body corporate fees. So it's not a long-term solution. Where we've seen some success is when the values of the property continue to go up.
Yeah, then you can, if they continue to go up, or you made a lot of equity, and all of a sudden you're sitting on a property that you might have a loan with yourself, and then loan with yourself of $3 million, and the thing's worth $4.5 million. You can then go to Mr. ANZ or maybe one of these bigger banks and say, hey, give me a lower LVR, and the rent and the rest of it, and you might have.
So you'd like to think there's some income coming out of the property on completion. Correct. So there should be some rental income. With the guys doing land subdivisions, though, obviously there's no income.
Yeah.
So that's typically a lot harder for the banks to finance a residual stock position in that instance, because there's no rental income. But private lenders still will do that deal every day of the week at reasonable gearing levels. So
where do you see finance heading? Because I put my finance cap on, and I know that there's a lot of money out there, right, that is ripe and ready for lending, whether it's direct as a JV partner, whether they're investing in your funds and then you're lending it back out, or whether they're investing it in the big corporates. And then the banks, the big banks are becoming a lot more difficult to deal with, I think, in the property development side of things. They're giving away a lot of business to people like yourself because of how conservative they are and have been. And they've been like that for quite some time now. And I see this market that has been created where the Fincierges, and there's so many lenders now out there that are doing this type of thing because there's an appetite for that money. From your personal experience, obviously this is what you do day to day. How do you see the finance lending landscape in the future? Do you think it's going to become harder? Do you think it's going to access money?
To access capital as a developer?
Yeah, I mean, in your opinion, from big four traditional banks, interest rate, cheap, that type of thing of getting development finance versus your sector, I'm seeing them being a lot more conservative, saying no. And this developer's going, I still need to access cash. I got to find Chris from Fincierges. Do you see that growing, or do you see them coming back and being a bit more bullish in that market because they got to lend money?
Yeah.
So.
No, I don't think the banks will recapture that market share. If you look in Europe and the States, where private credits as an industry is a lot more mature than Australia, they're getting up to 30, 40%, 50% market share.
Wow.
In our country, still sort of mixed, but it should be around about 15%, I think.
Yeah.
So interestingly, Metrics, when they founded, were actually 30% owned by the National Bank, and the National Bank put money into their fund. So, and then a few years later, the NAB got out of that deal and did quite well, but they were part of that. To me, like, what the heck's going on? Why wouldn't you just lend it yourself? Why are you then giving it to someone else to on lend at a premium with a few less conditions? But it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier around capital adequacy, and the bank now has to put more of their own money aside to lend out to developers, and it's just not as profitable. So I think there's going to be more and more of it privately. Just in my time in the industry now, sort of 15 years, when I first started, there might have been 3 or 4 property development brokers around southeast Queensland that knew what they were doing. Maybe a couple more, but and less lenders in Queensland. A lot of the private lending from a family office and institutional perspective was out of Sydney and particularly Melbourne. So Brisbane was, when I first started, people wouldn't lend to Brisbane because I worried about it being, it's too far away and what's going on up there, nothing, right? You just
Now they're all coming.
Yeah. And now half of them have got, offices up here and they're expanding and they understand, Queensland's growth story that we've been trying to tell them for the last 15 years. But there's a lot more of those guys out there. So I can't see it changing, to be honest. I think it's becoming more and more competitive for us as a broker, more and more competitive for lenders. Like I know as a broker when things are quiet because I get calls from my lenders saying, you got any deals for us? Because we're pretty quiet at the moment. And, there's got to be an equalisation of the market at some point where, the fit survive and the rest die off. And there's got to be a maturity level to our market. But I still think we're still in growth phase. So I can't see the banks really investing in that. And you just got to look at how many bankers are moving over to the dark side in property development finance.
Yeah, so many, and some that I know personally. I agree with you. I think the banks are happy, lending to mom and pa and doing their, business finance and standard mortgages. Obviously, there's not many banks to choose from, like somewhere in the US. So they've obviously got a larger market share on that side of things. But I agree with you. I think there's just going to create more. I think it's going to be create more competition in the private market, which is probably going to put pressure on interest rates and pricing.
Yeah, it has.
Because when you look at what pricing was 5 years ago in private versus now, I'm assuming it'll be a lot cheaper.
Definitely.
And in 5 years from now, that could be maybe the same thing. Did you guys have anything to add?
Oh, no, I just think hopefully people at home just can get some confidence that we've got the view now that if we find a good deal, the money will be there. Wherever we've got to give away 50% of the equity, wherever we can structure long settlements to get that uplift to then get into the deal ourselves, I've found if the margin's there and you find a good deal, the money will be there. So yes, when I started out, I wasn't traveling in the circles where I was rubbing shoulders with the Erics of the world, and I didn't know the Fincierges. For me, that was like the golden goose of like, if I could just find someone with money, then I could do this. So I gave up so many deals just because I didn't understand. And I did what you were saying a couple of years ago. I decided we need to work this private finance thing out. Yes, the guy that was getting cooked, that I bought the site off paying 4% a month, there wasn't those, it's not all bad. So, we took the time to understand it and met with a number of brokers and landed with Fincierge. But I think the take home message hopefully is that, if there's a decent enough deal out there, the money will be there. You just got to get creative with the strategies, get in the right rooms, connect with people. We're setting up unemployable property. So joint ventures will form naturally, and there's different places we can point people in to create those relationships. But yeah, I think it's exciting. Like that the privates, it went from being a really scary space to me to something that's really exciting. Of if I find the right deal and structure on deals, like no deals necessarily too big, because even if it is too big, we can flip it to the guys that are looking for the big stuff. So if you can control a site that might be, manufactured home parks, for example, or a larger subdivision. If you can option it, control it, or even if you've got to sell it short term, if you've got a buyer in the waiting, Chris will happily facilitate something for you.
So we funded 100% of a project recently based on Uplift, not yours either, which was close. You guys put a bit of equity in, but not a lot. And it was based on the fact that he'd already sold half of the land for what we were lending him, basically. So he'd wrapped the deal up to a point where it was risky up front, but as soon as you read down another 3 lines, it was totally de-risked. And so there's definitely deals out there, and you've got to be, smart enough to find them and structure them. And that's exactly my advice. It's so hard to find a good deal and to structure it, and to have an owner that's willing to participate in that process. So if you find them, they're difficult, and there's a lot of bigger players out there that would buy buy that option off you if you can't make it work.
Did you have anything to add, Shannon?
No, that was good.
Chris, again, thank you very much for being here. And we're going to be doing more of these podcasts, bringing experts in, talking about specific things around the property development space.
Yep.
And I just want to say again, thank you to Carson and Shannon for obviously creating a relationship with Chris and introducing him to myself, and James, who's here live in the studio having a watch because we have a meeting after this. And just want to say thank you very much. And if people want to get in contact with you, what's the best way to get in contact with Fincierge?
Well, by email address or phone.
Yeah. What's the best email?
So chris@fincierge.com.
Yeah. So that's Chris, CHRIS @fincierge.com.au. And that's FINCIERGE, not concierge.
Yes.
Fincierge.
It's a play on concierge.
Yeah,
My business partner came up with that.
I actually like the name. .com.au. And for those of you guys that don't know yet, we now have a live free Facebook group for unemployable property. We just launched that not long ago. Not sure when this is going to be filmed, so I won't say last week. And just go on there. There'll be a fair few, just some questions once you register that you need to answer. And then our admin team will then approve you. And you will have access to plenty of videos, real raw videos of some of the stuff I'm doing, a lot of the stuff that Shannon and Carson are doing. And as well, we're bringing on experts shortly to do, once a month webinars and speaking about topics like finance and town planning and architecture and engineering and how to find sites, all these things. It's a free Facebook group, Unemployable Property. Once again, guys, thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next one.
Hey there, I hope you enjoyed that episode of Unemployable. If you'd like to watch another episode, just click there.